"You have 2 weeks to leave," my daughter-in-law whispered beside my husband's casket, her voice so soft that anyone else might have mistaken it for sympathy. But I heard every word clearly, each one landing with a weight far heavier than the polished oak box in front of me. And for a moment I thought I had misunderstood. That grief had distorted my hearing the same way it had blurred the edges of everything else since the hospital room, since the doctor's careful tone, since the silence that followed. But when I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes, I saw no confusion there, no kindness, only a calm certainty that made my chest feel hollow. And I realized then that this was not something said in haste, not something born of stress or sorrow, but something decided long before today, long before the funeral flowers were arranged or the obituary printed, something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment when I would be at my weakest, standing in a black dress I had chosen only 2 days ago, greeting people with a polite smile I barely felt, thanking them for coming as if I were hosting a gathering instead of saying goodbye to the man I had shared 43 years with. And I said nothing in return, not because I didn't have words, but because I suddenly understood that anything I said would only confirm what she already believed, that I was fragile, that I was alone, that I had nowhere else to go. So I kept my gaze steady, nodded once as if she had commented on the weather, and turned back toward the line of guests moving slowly past the casket, their voices low, their faces blurred together in a procession of condolences that felt distant and unreal. And somewhere behind me I could hear my son speaking to someone. His tone polite, controlled, the same tone he used in business meetings, the same tone he had used all morning with me, careful and measured, as if I were someone he needed to manage rather than his own mother. And I wondered, not for the first time, when that change had happened, when the boy who used to reach for my hand had become a man who couldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. And I thought about the house waiting for us after this, the house that still smelled faintly of my husband's cologne, the house where his shoes were still by the door and his coffee mug still sat in the sink from that last morning, the house I had believed was mine as much as his, built room by room over decades of careful saving and shared decisions. And yet standing there in that quiet chapel, with soft music playing and flowers arranged too perfectly along the walls, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet awareness that the ground beneath my feet was no longer as solid as I had always believed, that the life I thought I understood had already begun to change in ways I hadn't seen. And as the service continued, as people took their seats and the pastor began to speak about legacy and love and the years my husband had spent building a life for his family, I found myself listening differently, not just to the words being said, but to the spaces between them, to the subtle glances exchanged across the room, to the way my daughter-in-law sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, composed and attentive, as if nothing unusual had just passed between us. And I realized that whatever was coming next had already been set in motion, that the 2 weeks she had given me were not an impulsive demand but a timeline, a schedule that fit neatly into plans I had not been included in. And for the first time since I had stood at the graveside earlier that morning, feeling as though half of my world had been lowered into the ground, I felt something else begin to take shape beneath the grief, something quieter but steadier, a need to understand, to look more closely at everything I had taken for granted, because if there was one thing I knew with certainty in that moment, it was that people do not reveal their true intentions by accident, especially not on the day of a funeral. And as I sat there with my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression composed, my silence intact, I made a decision that no one else in that room could see, not my son, not the woman sitting beside him, not even the friends who believed they were there to support a grieving widow, because the truth was, I had just been given 2 weeks, and I intended to use every single day of them to find out exactly what had been decided without me. I did not speak to her again that afternoon, not even when we stood side by side at the cemetery while the last handfuls of dirt were placed gently over the casket, not when people approached us with quiet condolences and careful smiles, not even when my son rested his hand briefly on my shoulder in a gesture that felt more rehearsed than sincere. And when it was over and the crowd began to thin, I followed them back to the house without asking any questions, because something inside me had already shifted from grief into observation, and for the first time in many years, I stopped moving through my own home as if it were simply an extension of my life and began seeing it as if I were a visitor, someone noticing details that had always been there but had never seemed important before, like the way the living room had been rearranged slightly, the armchair that used to sit near the window now pushed closer to the wall, or the way the hallway table no longer held the small framed photograph of my husband and me from our 25th anniversary, replaced instead by a decorative bowl I did not recognize, and I told myself these were small things, natural changes after a difficult week, but the feeling lingered, quiet and persistent, like a question I could not quite form into words, and as the evening settled in, bringing with it that particular kind of silence that only follows a long day filled with people, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator as if I had forgotten why I had opened it, and that was when I noticed it, a set of neatly organized containers labeled in a handwriting that was not mine, meals prepared in advance, carefully portioned, stacked with a precision that felt deliberate, as if someone had already planned for a routine that did not include me, and I closed the door slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the stainless steel surface, and for a moment I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me, her posture still composed, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, and I turned to the sound of footsteps behind me, my daughter-in-law entering the kitchen with that same quiet confidence she had carried all day, moving past me without hesitation, opening cabinets as if she had every right to decide what belonged where, and perhaps she believed she did. Perhaps that was what those 2 weeks truly meant, not just time for me to leave, but time for her to take complete control, and I watched her for a moment, saying nothing, noticing how comfortable she seemed, how settled, as if the house had already become hers in every way that mattered, and when my son joined us, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, he spoke to her first, asking about dinner plans, discussing schedules for the coming days, conversations that flowed easily between them while I stood just a few feet away, uninvited into the rhythm of their lives, and it was not the exclusion itself that unsettled me, but the ease of it, the way it felt practiced, as if this distance had been growing for far longer than I had allowed myself to see. And later, when I went upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband for decades, I paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar details that now felt strangely fragile, his side of the bed still slightly indented, his watch resting on the nightstand exactly where he had left it, and I crossed the room slowly, running my fingers along the dresser, the surface smooth and cool beneath my touch. And that was when I noticed the drawer slightly ajar, just enough to reveal that something inside had been disturbed, and I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house, to the faint murmur of voices downstairs, and I felt that same steady awareness return, stronger now, more defined, because whatever was happening here was not sudden, not accidental. It was a series of decisions made quietly, carefully, over time, and I realized then that grief had not made me blind. It had simply made me slower to question, slower to see what was already unfolding around me, and as I gently closed the drawer without looking inside, I understood that the 2 weeks I had been given were not just a deadline. They were an opportunity, a window of time in which I could choose to remain the person they believed me to be, or become someone they had clearly not prepared for. And I turned off the light, leaving the room in darkness, my steps steady as I moved back into the hallway, no longer drifting through the house in quiet sorrow, but moving with intention, because whatever had been set in motion before today, I intended to understand every part of it before those 2 weeks were over. The next morning began earlier than I expected, not because I had slept well, but because the house no longer held the same quiet rhythm it once did. The kind of silence that used to feel comforting now replaced by the subtle sounds of movement downstairs, cabinets opening, footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, the low hum of conversation that stopped just long enough whenever I approached the stairs to make me aware that something had shifted in ways that no one felt the need to explain to me. And I paused halfway down, my hand resting lightly on the banister, listening not to the words themselves but to the tone, to the ease with which decisions were being made without me. And when I stepped into the kitchen, both of them turned toward me with expressions that were polite, composed, and distant all at once, as if they had already agreed on how this new version of our shared space would function, and my daughter-in-law offered a brief smile before returning to the stack of papers spread neatly across the counter, her pen moving steadily as she made small notes in the margins, and I did not need to see the documents to understand that they were important, that they belonged to something larger than grocery lists or household chores, and my son stood beside her, his coffee untouched, his attention fixed on the same pages, nodding occasionally as she spoke in that calm, measured voice that always seemed to carry more weight than necessary, and I moved quietly to the other side of the room, pouring myself a cup of coffee, noticing how the familiar cupboard had been reorganized, mugs placed in a different order, the small details rearranged with a confidence that suggested permanence rather than temporary adjustment, and I took a sip, the taste unchanged but the experience entirely different, as if I were borrowing someone else's routine, and for a moment no one spoke to me, no one acknowledged my presence beyond that initial glance, and I allowed the silence to stretch, not out of discomfort, but because I wanted to see how long it would last, how naturally they would continue without including me, and it lasted longer than I expected, long enough for my daughter-in-law to gather the papers into a neat stack and slide them into a folder, long enough for my son to check his watch and mention an appointment they needed to keep later that afternoon, long enough for me to understand that whatever those documents contained, they were not meant for me to see, and I set my cup down carefully, the soft sound against the counter drawing their attention just enough for my son to offer a brief explanation about meeting with someone regarding next steps. His words vague, his tone reassuring in a way that felt practiced rather than genuine, and I nodded as if I understood, as if I had been included in the conversation from the beginning, and then I turned away, not because I was dismissed, but because I chose to leave before I could be, and as I walked through the hallway, I noticed more changes, small but deliberate, the guest room door slightly open with boxes stacked inside, labeled in neat handwriting, my handwriting, boxes I had not packed, and I paused at the threshold, my eyes moving slowly over each one, recognizing the contents without opening them, winter coats, photo albums, things that had always been stored carefully, intentionally, now gathered together as if someone had decided they were no longer needed in the spaces they once occupied. And I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and for a moment I simply stood there, surrounded by pieces of my own life that had been quietly set aside, and I felt that same calm awareness settle deeper within me, not anger, not even sadness but clarity, the kind that comes when something unspoken finally becomes visible, and I reached for one of the boxes, running my fingers over the taped edges, noting how recently it had been sealed, how little effort had been made to hide what was happening, and that was when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice again, closer this time, just outside the door, speaking softly but firmly, the way she always did when she wanted something done efficiently, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough to understand the intention, references to timing, to preparation, to making sure everything was ready within the next 2 weeks, and I closed my eyes briefly, letting the meaning settle into place, because this was no longer a question of whether I was being asked to leave, it was a question of how long this had been planned, how many quiet decisions had already been made while I believed I was still part of this family in the way I always had been, and when I opened my eyes again, I no longer felt like a guest in my own home, I felt like an observer standing just outside a carefully constructed plan, one that I had not been invited into, and as I placed the box back exactly where I had found it, aligning it neatly with the others, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by what they expected of me, but by what I chose to uncover before those 2 weeks came to an end. That afternoon, after the house had emptied and the sound of their car pulling out of the driveway faded into the distance, I did something I had not allowed myself to do in days. I sat down in the living room without a task, without a purpose, and let the quiet settle around me long enough for my thoughts to surface clearly, and it was in that stillness that the past began to rearrange itself, not as memories softened by time, but as moments sharpened by new understanding, small details that had once seemed harmless now returning with a different weight, like the conversations my husband had started in the months before he passed, the ones I had brushed aside because they felt unnecessary, overly cautious, and I could hear his voice again, steady and deliberate, asking if I had reviewed the paperwork he had left on his desk, asking if I remembered where he kept the copies of certain documents, and at the time I had smiled, reassuring him that everything would be fine, that there was no need to worry about such things. But now, sitting there in a house that no longer felt entirely mine, I realized those questions had not been casual, they had been intentional, and I stood slowly, the realization settling into me with a quiet urgency, and made my way upstairs to his study, a room that had remained mostly untouched since the day he was taken to the hospital, the door still slightly ajar, the faint scent of old paper and polished wood greeting me as I stepped inside, and for a moment I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the space he had always kept so carefully organized, and then I crossed the room, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of his desk as I took in the familiar arrangement of items, the pen he favored, the small stack of unopened mail, the leather-bound notebook he used for his personal notes, and I opened the top drawer slowly, expecting to find the same neat order I remembered, but instead I found it partially empty, the contents reduced to a few scattered papers and an envelope that had been opened and resealed, and I felt a quiet shift inside me, not surprise but confirmation, and I reached for the envelope, turning it over in my hands, noting the slight crease along the edge, the way it had been handled more than once, and I slid the contents out carefully, scanning the page with a calm focus that surprised even me. Legal language printed in precise lines, references to property, ownership and transfer, and though I did not need to understand every term to grasp the meaning, I saw enough to recognize that this was not the complete picture, that something had been altered or removed, and I placed the document back inside the envelope exactly as I had found it, returning it to the drawer with the same care, because whatever had been taken from this room had not been done in haste, it had been done with purpose. And as I straightened, my eyes moved to the bookshelf along the far wall, to a row of binders that had always been kept in perfect alignment, and I walked over, running my fingers lightly along the spines until I found the one I was looking for, the one labeled in my husband's handwriting, and I pulled it free, opening it to the first page, and there it was, not hidden, not concealed, but simply waiting to be noticed by someone who knew where to look. Copies of documents, detailed notes, and a small section marked with a date from just a few weeks before his passing, and I turned the pages slowly, each one revealing a clearer picture of what he had been preparing, protections, conditions, instructions that extended beyond the surface of what anyone else might assume, and I felt a steadiness return to me, a quiet certainty that whatever had been set in motion downstairs had not accounted for everything, that my husband had not left things as unguarded as they believed, and I closed the binder gently, holding it for a moment before placing it back exactly where it belonged, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done, it was about understanding what had been planned on both sides. And as I left the study, closing the door softly behind me, I realized that the question was no longer whether I would leave in 2 weeks, but whether they truly understood what those 2 weeks would reveal. And for the first time since that quiet sentence had been spoken beside the casket, I felt something settle firmly into place. Not fear, not grief, but control, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that might have gone unnoticed before, but now every movement, every word, every small decision carried a clarity I could no longer ignore, and when they returned in the early evening, their energy felt different, lighter in a way that suggested progress, as if something had been confirmed or finalized while I was upstairs in that study, and I watched from the living room as they stepped inside, my daughter-in-law setting her bag down. With practiced ease, my son loosening his tie again, their conversation flowing uninterrupted until they noticed me, and even then, there was no pause long enough to suggest surprise, only a brief shift in tone, polite, measured, controlled, and I realized then that my presence no longer altered the course of their actions, it merely existed alongside them, and I rose slowly, meeting my son's eyes just long enough to offer a calm question about their afternoon. And his answer came quickly. Something about paperwork, about meeting with someone who was helping them organize things. The words vague, the meaning unmistakable, and I nodded once, allowing the conversation to pass without pressing further, because I no longer needed them to explain what they were doing. I needed them to continue believing that I would not question it, and as dinner came and went with a quiet efficiency that felt more like routine than morning, I noticed how naturally they moved through the space, how decisions were made without hesitation, how plans for the coming days were discussed openly between them but never directed toward me, and I played my part carefully, responding when spoken to, offering no resistance, no curiosity, no sign that anything had shifted within me, because the truth was, the less I appeared to notice, the more they revealed. And later that evening, as I cleared my plate and placed it in the sink, my daughter-in-law's voice followed me into the kitchen, gentle but firm, reminding me of the timeline she had already set, mentioning the importance of starting early, so that everything could be handled smoothly, her tone almost helpful, as if she were offering guidance rather than issuing a directive. And I turned to face her, meeting her gaze with the same calm expression I had carried all day, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker there, not doubt, but a subtle expectation, as if she were waiting for me to resist, to question, to show some sign of distress that would confirm her position, and when I simply nodded, agreeing that it would be best to begin organizing my things soon, that flicker disappeared, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that told me everything I needed to know. And she turned away, already moving on to the next task, confident in the outcome she believed was inevitable, and I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling around us, the low hum of appliances, the faint echo of footsteps upstairs, and I allowed myself a single breath before stepping away from the sink, my movement steady, deliberate, as I made my way back toward the hallway, because now the pieces were no longer scattered, they were beginning to align, the documents in the study, the missing pages, the prepared boxes, the carefully managed conversations, all of it forming a pattern that was no longer hidden, and I understood that whatever had been arranged was built on the assumption that I would remain exactly as they saw me, quiet, grieving, compliant, and, as I reached the staircase, placing my hand lightly on the railing, I realized how much power there was in allowing them to keep that belief, because while they continued to move forward with their plans, certain that the outcome was already decided, I had already stepped outside of it, no longer reacting, no longer questioning openly, but observing, learning, preparing, and as I climbed the stairs, each step measured and unhurried, I knew that the next move would not be theirs, it would be mine, and when the time came it would not need to be loud or dramatic, it would simply need to be undeniable. By the third day, the rhythm of the house had settled into something that no longer resembled mourning, but rather transition, quiet and efficient, as if grief had already been accounted for and set aside in favor of more practical concerns, and I moved through it carefully, not disrupting anything, not questioning, simply observing the way my daughter-in-law checked her phone frequently, the way my son began taking calls in another room with the door partially closed, his voice lowered but not enough to hide the tone of urgency that had replaced the softness he once carried, and it was in those small fractures of sound that the truth began to take clearer shape, because when you listen closely enough, people reveal more in what they try to soften than in what they say directly, and that morning as I passed by the study again, I noticed the door was no longer left slightly open, it was closed completely, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed before, but now felt deliberate. And I paused, not reaching for the handle, only standing there long enough to confirm what I already understood, that access had been quietly restricted, not announced, not discussed, simply assumed, and I continued down the hallway, allowing that detail to settle into the growing pattern I was beginning to see, because each change, each adjustment, pointed to something larger than simple reorganization, it pointed to control, and later that afternoon, as I sat at the small desk in the guest room surrounded by the boxes that had been prepared without my knowledge, I began opening them one by one, not with urgency, but with intention, checking the contents carefully, noting what had been included and what had been left behind, and it did not take long to see the logic behind it, items of sentiment packed neatly away, items of value nowhere to be found, and I smiled faintly at that, not out of amusement but out of recognition, because whoever had done this had been thorough, but not thorough enough, and as I reached the bottom of one box, my fingers brushed against something small and flat, an envelope tucked beneath a stack of folded linens, and I pulled it free slowly, turning it over to see my husband's handwriting, my name written clearly across the front, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the quiet certainty that this had been placed here intentionally, not overlooked, not forgotten, but hidden in plain sight, and I opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. His words written with the same steady hand I had known for decades, and as I read, the last pieces of uncertainty fell away, replaced by a clarity so complete that it left no room for doubt, because what he had outlined was not just preparation, it was protection, specific instructions, conditions tied to behavior, safeguards that extended beyond what anyone might assume from the surface of a standard document, and I lowered the paper slowly, my mind already moving ahead, connecting what I had found with what I had seen, the missing pages in the study, the controlled access, the urgency in their conversations, and I understood then that they were working from an incomplete version of the truth, one that served their intentions but did not account for everything my husband had put in place, and I folded the letter again with care, slipping it back into the envelope before placing it aside, not returning it to the box, because this was not something I intended to leave hidden any longer, and as I sat there, the quiet of the room wrapping around me, I felt that steady sense of control deepen, not something forced or dramatic, but something earned through understanding, because now I knew that whatever plan they believed was already in motion, it had been built on the assumption that they had access to everything, that they had seen every document, every instruction, every detail that mattered, and that assumption was where their certainty would begin to unravel, and as I closed the last box and stood, my movements calm and deliberate, I realized that the next step would not require confrontation, it would require timing, because the truth does not need to be shouted to be heard, it only needs to be revealed at the moment when it can no longer be ignored, and as I stepped out into the hallway, the envelope still in my hand, I understood that moment was no longer far away. The following day, I began doing exactly what they expected of me, and that was the most important part because compliance, when done carefully, can reveal more than resistance ever could, and I moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that matched their own, gathering a few items at a time, folding clothes, sorting through drawers, placing things into boxes that were already waiting as if they had known I would need them, and I did not rush. I did not hesitate, I simply worked at a steady pace that gave the impression of acceptance, and I could feel their attention shift as they noticed, not openly, not in a way that would invite conversation, but in the subtle way people observe something they believe is going according to plan. And by midday, my daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway of the guest room, her expression composed, her tone carefully neutral as she asked if I needed help arranging transportation or finding a place to stay, and I turned toward her with the same calm I had carried since the beginning, thanking her for the offer and explaining that I would take care of it myself, that I had already begun making arrangements, and I watched as that answer settled into her, not surprising her but reassuring her, confirming that everything was unfolding as she had anticipated, and she nodded once before stepping away, already satisfied, and it was in that moment that I understood just how much they relied on predictability, on the assumption that I would behave within the limits they had quietly assigned to me, and as the afternoon passed I continued my work, but I chose carefully what I packed and what I left behind, allowing certain things to remain untouched, visible, as if they no longer mattered, while keeping close the items that held actual significance, documents, small records, details that could not be replaced. And later, when the house grew quiet again and the soft glow of evening light stretched across the hallway, I made my way back to the study, not to search this time, but to confirm what I already knew, and the door was still closed but not locked, and I stepped inside with the same measured calm, moving directly to the desk, opening the drawer just enough to see that the envelope I had returned earlier remained exactly where I had left it, which told me something equally important, that they had not yet realized what was missing, that they believed they had already secured everything they needed, and I closed the drawer again, leaving no trace of disturbance, because the power in this moment was not in revealing what I knew, but in allowing them to continue believing that nothing had changed. And as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard voices from downstairs, low but distinct, my son speaking in a tone I had not heard in years, confident, almost certain, discussing timelines, mentioning signatures, and I paused just long enough to listen, not for the details, but for the certainty behind them, because certainty often reveals more than information itself, and I realized then that they were already thinking beyond these 2 weeks, already planning what would come after, already placing themselves firmly in a future where I no longer existed within these walls, and I continued down the stairs, letting my presence interrupt nothing, letting the conversation shift naturally as I entered the room, and I took my place quietly observing, allowing them to speak as they always did, because every word, every glance, every small assumption they made was another piece of understanding, and by the time night settled fully around us, I no longer felt like someone being asked to leave, I felt like someone being underestimated, and there is a particular kind of advantage in that, one that does not announce itself, one that does not demand attention, but simply waits, patient and precise, for the moment when expectation and reality no longer align. And as I returned upstairs, placing the envelope carefully in a place they would not think to look, I understood that I had already stepped beyond the role they had written for me, and now all that remained was to choose exactly when to show them that they had been wrong. All along. On the 5th day, they told me we would need to meet with a lawyer, and the way my son said it, carefully, as if he were trying to sound considerate, told me everything before he even finished the sentence, because this was not an invitation, it was a step in a process that had already been decided, and I looked at him for a moment, long enough to let him wonder what I might say, and then I nodded, agreeing without hesitation, and I saw the relief in his expression, quick and subtle, but there. Because agreement was what they expected, and as we drove to the office later that afternoon, I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar streets pass by through the window, noticing how ordinary everything looked, how unchanged the world remained while something far more personal was being rearranged quietly within it. And when we arrived, the building stood as it always had, clean lines, polished glass, a place where decisions were made on paper but carried consequences far beyond it, and I followed them inside, my step steady, my posture calm, because by now I understood that presence mattered, not in what I said, but in how I appeared, and when we entered the office, the man waiting for us greeted my son and daughter-in-law first, his tone warm, familiar, as if this was not their first conversation, and that alone confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that these discussions had been happening before I was ever told. And when he turned to me, his smile shifted slightly, polite but less certain, as if he were unsure how much I knew, and I met his gaze evenly, offering no clarification, no indication of surprise, because the less I revealed, the more he would have to assume, and we sat down, papers arranged neatly across the table, and my daughter-in-law began to speak, her voice composed, outlining what she described as a plan to ensure everything was handled properly, her words careful, structured, designed to sound reasonable, and my son added to it, occasionally reinforcing the narrative, explaining how it would be easier if certain transitions were made sooner rather than later, and I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, simply allowing them to build their case, because every detail they offered was another confirmation of what they believed to be true. And when the lawyer finally spoke, his tone measured, referring to documents that outlined ownership, authority, and the next steps required to formalize the arrangement, I felt the final piece settle into place, because this was the version of the truth they had been working from, incomplete, convenient, and entirely dependent on my silence, and for a moment no one spoke, the air in the room still expectant, as if they were waiting for me to respond, to agree, to confirm what they had already decided. And I placed my hands gently on the table, my fingers resting lightly against the surface, and I allowed a small pause, just long enough to shift the balance of the room, and then I reached into my bag, slowly, deliberately, and withdrew the envelope I had kept hidden, placing it in front of me without opening it, and I saw the change immediately, not dramatic, not sudden but unmistakable, a slight tightening in my daughter-in-law's posture, a flicker of uncertainty crossing my son's face, and the lawyer's attention sharpening as he noticed the movement, and I met his eyes calmly before sliding the envelope across the table toward him, my voice steady, quiet, as I explained that there were additional documents that needed to be reviewed before any decisions were made, and for the first time since we had entered that room, the direction of the conversation shifted, not loudly, not forcefully, but undeniably, and as the lawyer opened the envelope, his expression changing as he read, the certainty that had filled the room moments earlier began to fade, replaced by something far less stable, and I sat back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because I did not need to say anything more. The truth was already there, written clearly, waiting to be understood, and as the silence stretched between us, I realized that this was the moment they had not prepared for, the one detail they had overlooked, and I allowed it to unfold exactly as it needed to, without interruption, without explanation, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply let the truth speak for itself. The silence in the room did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something settling after being disturbed, and I watched as the lawyer continued reading, his expression changing in small, controlled ways that only someone paying close attention would notice, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause between lines, a second glance at a section that clearly carried more weight than the rest, and when he finally looked up, the confidence that had filled the room earlier was no longer there, replaced by a careful neutrality that signaled everything had just changed, and he turned his attention first to my son, then to my daughter-in-law. His tone measured as he began to explain what the document outlined, conditions, protections, stipulations that had not been included in the version they had presented, and I saw it then, not in dramatic reactions, but in the quiet collapse of certainty, the way my daughter-in-law's posture stiffened, the way my son's gaze shifted away from mine, searching for something solid that was no longer there, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because this moment did not require anything from me, it only required patience, and as the lawyer continued, clarifying that ownership, control, and authority were not as straightforward as they had assumed, that there were conditions tied to conduct, to intent, to the way certain actions were carried out, I felt no need to interrupt, no need to emphasize what was already clear, because the truth once seen does not need to be argued, and when the explanation ended the room fell quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, one that carried uncertainty rather than expectation, and my son finally spoke, his voice lower now, less certain, asking questions that revealed just how incomplete his understanding had been, and the answers he received only confirmed what I had already known, that the decisions they had made were built on an assumption that no longer held, and my daughter-in-law tried to respond, her tone still controlled but no longer steady, adjusting her words, reframing her intentions, But it was too late for that because intention once questioned cannot be easily restored, and I watched them both for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that left no room for confusion, and then I stood slowly, allowing the movement to draw their attention, and I spoke for the first time since we had entered that office, my voice calm, even explaining that I would not be making any decisions that day, that there was no urgency on my part, and that any further discussion would happen on my terms, not theirs, and I saw the shift immediately, the realization settling in that the timeline they had created no longer belonged to them, and I gathered my things without hurry, without hesitation, because there was nothing left to prove in that room, and as I walked toward the door, I paused briefly, not turning back, only allowing a moment of stillness to settle behind me, because sometimes closure does not come from confrontation, it comes from understanding exactly where you stand, and then choosing to move forward without needing permission. And when I stepped outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, simply clearer, and as I made my way down the steps and into the quiet of the afternoon, I realized that the 2 weeks I had been given had never truly been about leaving, they had been about revealing, and now that everything had come into view, there was nothing left for me to wait for, nothing left for me to prove, only the quiet certainty that I was no longer part of a plan I had never agreed to, and that from this moment forward every decision would belong to me alone, and I walked away without looking back, not because there was nothing behind me, but because I finally understood that I no longer needed to stay where I was not respected, and that was something no document, no plan, and no assumption could ever take away. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.